Welcome to Grappling with the Great, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Jonas Olson, and I would like to welcome my guest. With me today is Deb Coviello, aka the Drop-In CEO. She's an author, speaker, podcast host, and silver medalist curler who coaches C-suite leaders of today and tomorrow to navigate challenges with confidence. Mark Brown is a world champion international speaker, executive host, and, most important, devoted husband of Andrew. And Kirsten Yurich is an organizational performance management consultant, peer leaders group chair with Vistage Worldwide Incorporated, and adjunct professor of education at Felician University. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Pleasure, Jonathan. Pleasure.
And here is our topic for the day. Last year, world civilization teacher Sarah Inama at Idaho's Lewis and Clark Middle School resigned rather than comply with orders to remove from her classroom a poster deemed inappropriate by administrators, who said the poster violated the school's content-neutral policy, which prohibits any speech or messaging that might reflect personal opinions, religious beliefs, or political ideologies. The sign read, quote, "Everyone is welcome here," unquote. And it showed hands of different colors. That was it. The district's chief academic officer, Marcus Myers, clarified that, quote, "The political environment ebbs and flows, and what might be controversial now might not have been controversial 3, 6, 9 months ago," unquote. Ms. Inama received an outpouring of support from the community, but it wasn't enough to change the district's mind. In her resignation letter, she wrote, quote, "I cannot align myself nor be complicit with the exclusionary views and decisions of the administration. It is deeply troubling that the people running this district and school have allowed a welcoming and inclusive message for my students to be considered controversial, political, and, worst of all, an opinion. I hope for the sake of the students in your district that you can remember the core values of public education to serve all citizens, foster an inclusive and safe learning environment, and protect your staff and students from discriminatory behavior," unquote. Does the school administration have a point? If so, what is it? And is it better for a teacher like Sarah Nama to make a statement by publicly resigning or to remain in her job to serve the students while trying to change the system from within? The floor is open.
I'll go first because I always have something.
Certainly.
What a
Take it away,
thought-provoking
Deb.
topic. And my brain was hurting a little bit as I was thinking about because I could play both sides of the fence. But just maybe just a thought on why it can be a little bit challenging is that in this particular ecosystem or educational district, it was construed as not being following their policy of being neutral in terms of opinion. And the interesting thing is, I also have worked for an entity that at the beginning of every meeting, through their DE&I initiatives or what or the company policy, they actually put up a slide that this is a safe environment, that everybody is equal, and if there is ever you're not feeling this way, feel free to express. So there is then a position of everybody's equal publicly stated within the company, and that's the value of the company. And then you have another ecosystem that says you are not neutral enough. So I think the teacher certainly has the right to express their dissent for this. But one has to judge then what ecosystems do we operate in, knowing that this is a controversial topic, and do we choose to be in systems that it is or isn't accepted versus others? We actually have a choice. So it's a tough one, but depending on the situation, she may be right and she may be wrong. And honestly, it's outside of her control.
Well, certainly seems to be outside of control. I'm hoping someone can help me see the lack of neutrality in this particular statement. So, please.
That won't come from me.
Well, Rabbi, I'm just taking a quick look at the quote here from
Yeah.
the district, and they said the political environment ebbs and flows, and what might be controversial now might not have been controversial 3, 6, 9 months ago.
Yeah.
What I found missing, and it may seem trite to even ask this, is what was controversial? Was it the everyone? Was it the welcome? Or was it the here? I'm going to make an assumption that here is important because they're addressing their own district that they're a part of. So what is it about here? And I appreciate them mentioning different paradigms, but what is it about here that would make everyone unwelcome? And I can't quite get my brain around that, but trying to parse the words, I know here refers to them. So is the issue that they said everyone? Was it the issue that they were welcome? In each case, I'm not clear on the intent of the policy, since the wording of the policy was not stated as in what you were given to us. So I'm at a loss to determine how they interpret the word everyone. Is it how they interpret what welcoming means? I may be getting into the weeds here, but in an attempt to understand, lacking any clarity, I must at least attempt to parse through. So if I say, okay, it's about here, it's yours. What does everyone represent? Are there issues regarding people who identify themselves in an ethnic group with a political mindset? Is it about how people self-identify? Because such issues are certainly raised in schools. Is it about gender neutrality? Is it about DEI? And when we say welcome, are they welcome to visit the facility and walk in the door? Are they welcome to participate in the education of the students? Clarification on those points, I think, would help us to understand their perspective more clearly and then give a more well-thought, reasonable response. But lacking that, I suspect we're left to our own devices on that point. And I leave that in Kirsten's lap.
Before you jump in, Kirsten, you do allude to an interesting point, Mark. Was this poster intended to be a response to a problem or concern, or was it simply a generic message for purely educational values? Kirsten,
Yeah,
where are you holding this?
So I think you both bring up two valuable things, but different things, right? So there may be the rest of the story in terms of the poster being up, and their action towards the teacher may be a bigger issue because of why she put up the poster, Jonathan, with your point. Maybe there is an issue and she was putting it up in response to an issue, and therefore it looks like an affront to her leadership, and then therefore they're going to act accordingly, right? So I think we can infer all of that. We don't know any of that in the post. Mark, your points, what I like about the parsing piece is we are given no information, no clarity, as you say, around what was actually violated. What and why was it against the policy, and what made it political in terms and the difference between politics and ebbing and flowing and things being controversial, sure. And then you have what she said in her statement was values. Our values or our virtues, they don't change, right? And so if inclusion is one of our values of public education, which she's saying is, that was the one of the underlying intents of the poster, right? So she's speaking to a value that should be permanent, and someone is interpreting it as controversial, which is not permanent, right? It's the flavor of the day. It's what I say where you say, pick your argument around controversial because it'll change tomorrow. But she's speaking to the value piece. So to me, I think that layers on a little bit of what you were talking about.
I should clarify and apologize. They did say, in quotes, it was a violation of the school's content neutral policy.
Right.
And they did say in quotes, but outside quotes, we read prohibits any speech or messaging that might reflect personal opinions, religious beliefs, or political ideologies. Right. However, what was stated as the quote when it said they they were concerned that the sign was in violation because the political environment ebbs and flows.
Right.
So that line says it wasn't was it an opinion?
Right.
Was it a religious belief? Or was it a political ideology?
Right.
Which begs the question, how is the phrase everyone is welcome here representative of a political ideology? And I know Deb is once again chomping at the bit to respond to that.
Yeah. And again, forgive me, my brain is all over the place. Sometimes I am ADD, but there's a couple things all over the place here that I'm thinking about is, you know, education is not just facts and figures, but, you know, didn't a while ago or maybe a few decades ago, we talked civics and values and things like that. And it feels like we've gotten so far away from that, or we don't even know how to instill our values in the system through and through respect. Talk, you know, when it's your turn, contribute, raise your hand, respect for others. You know, what if the sign said, we respect everyone? So I think there's still additional and the other thing that I want to talk about is, was there any other context? Again, Rabbi has provided us some flat text and a series of events for which then there's everybody is welcome here. Onto itself, it is neutral, potentially. What else existed in that environment? How did that teacher show up? What did they talk about in the classroom environment? That there could be a part 2 or a part 3 for which then the administration made some decisions. So it may have been more holistic. Again, it's just conjecture at this point,
Yeah.
but it's almost like we shouldn't judge until we know the rest of the story and dig a little bit deeper.
Let's
Yeah, the
call in
poster
Paul
could have
Harvey.
been. I
Let's
did it
call in Paul
first.
Harvey. Now you
That's
know
right.
the
I
rest
did.
of the story.
The poster could have been the straw, right, that broke the camel's back in terms
Yeah.
of knowing what other color and context is around the situation with the teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling inclined to quote Sigmund Freud, which I rarely do, that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Uh, you know, whatever context there might have been, whatever backstory, um, you know, I look at the poster and, you know, it's a bunch of hands. You know, I can't tell which one's a male hand with fingernail polish or which one is, you know, has piercings somewhere else. I mean, they're just different skin tones. So to read more into it, then we want to have an environment where everyone feels accepted and welcome. I'm having a real tough time.
What
As
are they
am
saying
I,
to take it
Rabbi.
down?
As am I, Rabbi.
I
Please continue.
admire you all for trying to see the other side of this, which is why we're here.
Wait, I'm also mystified, Rabbi, because when I'm looking at where is this? It's a middle school. I spent 25 years giving presentations in middle schools across North America. I've addressed over 1 million kids ages 12 through 15 in the last 25 years. So I now think of the demographic, the impressionable minds of middle schoolers
Right.
who still have a degree of innocence in their lives, and they see a poster with various colored hands. And I might feel different coming into that school for the first time from my home country of Jamaica.
Right.
And I see that poster and I see everyone is welcome here. I see my skin tone on the wall. And immediately I think, you know what? Mom and dad, they don't want to go to Idaho from Kingston, but I'm here. And that tells me I'm welcome. This teacher tells me I'm welcome.
Right.
I feel good. So how are the 13-year-olds with developing frontal lobes going to respond to that messaging when they're told a teacher who, I'm going to make an assumption, they may even like because they made that child feel welcome, they're told she's gone because they didn't like her poster and they wouldn't have a conversation about it. Would anyone even ask the kids how they feel about it? I have no idea. So I'm broadening the image now. What is the impact on the students, their families, the community? We have an indication here the community was in support of the teacher, but that was to no avail, if I read that correctly.
Right.
And if I'm wrong, please forgive me. Right?
If the board is supposed to be representative of the community, then shouldn't the community have a little more say?
And Have you been
Did
to
I
this
understand that the
before,
committee
David?
did, but the district chose to the district did not heed their concerns.
They're circling the wagons.
Now, again, I mean, I should backtrack a little bit because I was an educator and I know from experience that what the community wants is not always what's best for children. So there's definitely a balance there. The question is how much of this is actually an educational value versus, and we go back into our conjecture mode,
Yes.
ideologically driven. Now, I did look at a couple of other articles on this. And the sense, like, there wasn't a lot more information that was given, but the sense that I got, at least what was being projected in the articles, was that this was an overreaction. Well,
Mm.
let's try to not be pejorative. This was a reaction by a more conservative board against what many conservatives see as an attack upon traditional values and basic values by trying to inject identity politics into schools,
Ah.
especially at younger ages. And that their response was almost like your classic zero tolerance policy.
Mm.
We don't want anything that reflects identity in any way, shape, or form because that's not what we're here for. And while I can certainly sympathize with their intent, because I think in many cases things have been imposed upon children that they really shouldn't be dealing with at that age. If all of this conjecture is accurate, then I would say, from my point of view, it does appear like an overreaction.
I'm wondering, and also we're making guessing, might there be a level of securing a little bit of political, securing their accreditation, like potentially for their accreditation or funding, that there are overarching factors from the community that you may not cross the line, like you say, of having different political gender ideology in the classroom. So they're trying to keep themselves out of
Yeah.
trouble. Yes, somebody broke the camel's back. Somebody had to be the sacrificial lamb. But just something else to consider as we try to broaden our thoughts on like how could this have happened? There may have been external factors that required them to be so neutral
Yeah.
in fear of losing accreditation.
Yeah.
I
Well,
have more.
there's, I
Yeah, go
mean,
ahead.
recently is what, 2 years ago, maybe, a lot of companies went in and started stripping DEI language out of their
Yeah.
websites, right? So that they would not have adverse consequences.
Ebb and flow.
Right.
Okay.
Whether they would, want to keep the values of inclusion because of the importance and, positive outcomes that you get from being an actual inclusive environment. The term, again, the ebb and flow, became dangerous.
Well, dangerous. Another thought occurred to me, which we have sort of addressed before, but if everyone is welcome here, if that sign is politically controversial, because the political environment what might be controversial now. So I'm assuming I'm reading into it. I'm going to infer politically controversial. Everyone is welcome here.
Yeah.
If that sign is then controversial, it presupposes that everyone is not welcome here.
Right.
Then who is?
Right. That's the question.
I know, Deb. You were waiting for that, weren't you? You were waiting for that.
My brain was hurting before we got onto this conversation. It's now really twisted up and all over the place. And might I throw another one out there as well? When I think about, though, I'm just thinking about the teacher and I'm thinking about the whole system. At the end of the day, it's really not about a poster or signage,
No.
but, there's an element of free speech in here and trying to influence, et cetera. But one of the last things in your, description of our conversation, Jonathan, that you said, is it better for a teacher to make a statement by publicly resigning or to remain on the job and try to change the system from within? I'll just make a comment. It is noble to try to change the systems, but sometimes one has to realize that you just can't. It is the establishment. Maybe the greater opportunity is the fact that we all here are talking about it. She
Yeah.
has left her mark by taking the position of resigning, and it is now something worth publication and having debate over. So at the end of the day, while it's not a win or a lose in the situation, it's unfortunate what has happened. But ultimately, she's created something where we're having more
Mm.
deep conversations about what is right, what is wrong, or is it fluid,
Mm.
depending on how the wind blows.
Well said. And in terms of the idea of her staying on and fighting, I would submit it might not be worth her while. Because, and I'll say why I say that, based upon the information that we have in good rabbis post, one, I don't believe her decision was taken lightly and as a knee-jerk reaction. I think she really thought it through.
Yeah.
I believe she's concerned about her children. She talked very clearly about the whole idea of education and moral values. Number two, the document said there was an outpouring of support from the community. That did not sway the powers that be in the board of directors at the school.
Yeah.
I would suggest that should she stay on, she'd be fighting a losing battle,
Yeah.
trying to put her finger on the dike, kicking against the goads, all of the above, to use different metaphors.
Yeah.
I do not. I think she would invest more time, energy, and effort trying to change a system that has held firm against what she has done, while trying to give her students and their families the best she has to offer as an educator with good conscience. Just trying to fight that battle alone, I think, will diminish the impact she can have in the classroom.
Yeah.
She'll be distracted. She would not be able to give her best to the kids. The kids are going to ask questions. There'll be families who'll be upset. There may be even some who want to pull their kids out and go to private school. I have no idea. But I think fighting in that role as a teacher might not be as productive given the current political climate, to quote, to paraphrase what the board said. I think that might be a futile endeavor at this point in time. Now, they did say the climate will ebb and flow 6, 9 months, and maybe somewhere down the
Can
road,
rehire her.
they could revisit the conversation. Somebody else is on the board. There's been a change of heart, and they may consider bringing her back. I have no idea, but I wouldn't want to close the door on the possibility. I just think that sometimes a not now is a better answer than simply a no. And for her, it might be a not now.
Yeah,
think
I
we
will say
know.
that having spent about 25 years in the classroom with high school students, um, the impact that a teacher has on the students in the classroom is not directly affected so much by these types of policies or actions. Yes, it would be nice to have a poster up. I don't think that's going to be the single defining factor in these children's education. But I certainly went through periods where the faculty, the administration were really embattled against a board, against a community. And it was really remarkable how we supported each other
Mm.
and how we made our focus first, the students, and turned out results that I remain deeply, deeply proud of.
Mm.
So while I certainly sympathize with your point, Mark, and sometimes, given the millions of viewers who watch this program, perhaps the teacher's actions will ripple through society and have a profound effect. But the difference that one teacher can make in the life of a child by being in the classroom, um, there's no way to measure that.
I agree.
Well, I think, Mark, what I heard you talking about was more her impact on the system
Yes.
versus her impact on the students. And, I think we know as business people, if you pit a bad system and a good employee, we know the system is going to win, right? And so I think her ability to, push against the man and the system and those kinds of things would be futile. It would be a short runway. She'd burn out, those kinds of things. Jonathan, to your point, her creating an inclusive and welcoming environment for her students would probably be like head down. This is my focus. This is where I can make a difference. And her decision was just like, I can do that, but I'm not going to do it here. And I think that's fair. And I think that's her choice.
Absolutely.
I think, I spent a year and a half working with a superintendent of a district, very large district, and a very diverse district. With a big medical community, and so there's a lot of diversity in terms of the people that come into that district, and their whole strategic plan was around making students feel safe and included. The academics was the lagging. The leading was around the safety and the inclusion and the welcoming of the students. And it was just, it was amazing to watch them create that, measure that, implement that, and watch the success of that. And it was not a soft skill thing. It was a real, and it was, coming out of COVID, how important that was, because kids were out and away and separated, and how important that was to do that after that period of time. And that just kind of came back to mind as we're talking about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, values should start at home. But if the educational system where the students are there 6, 8 hours a day can continue that, like you said, it's foundational to the interactions we have. Because yes, you can teach them math and science and how to solve different problems, but we have to interface with people regardless of the diversity. It has to be neutral in order for them to continue the learning process. So I support that you have to set the stage. And I'm wondering, it was just a poster, but could there have been any conversation, if not the poster? Can she still hold fast to those values and making sure everybody's equal? So yeah, take down the poster, but was she still able to practice demonstrating the values of inclusivity, or did she have to?
Policies
Yeah.
were around that made her feel obligated to put that up? What else was happening in that ecosystem where maybe you are not welcome here, Mark, to your point earlier, but, maybe in my room, I'm trying to make that feel different.
That's interesting. I wish my son were seeing this. He used to be a classroom teacher. But something else occurred to me. In her response, she made statements which could be construed as drawing from the district's mission statement.
Yeah.
She said,
or the state.
I hope for the sake of the students in your district that you can remember the core values of public education, broad brush.
That could come from the state.
To serve all citizens, foster an inclusive and safe learning environment, and protect your staff and students from discriminatory behavior. Yeah. The reason I say this is, in the last several years, I've had opportunity to speak in several middle schools, particularly in one state here in North America. And I always went to their website to read their mission statement and their value statement. And the language here, talking about foster an inclusive and safe learning environment, protect your staff and students from discriminatory behavior. That's very, very common across the board as part of the mission statements that schools have. So I'm led to wonder what may have happened that would cause her to call back to it and say, listen, I thought I was doing that. Clearly, I am not. And then she says, the idea of considering her message to be welcoming, what she thought was welcoming, to be considered controversial, political, and worst of all, an opinion. Right. And to suggest that everyone is welcome here is an opinion, to me, just muddies the waters.
And they're diminishing it. They're diminishing that her statement, that poster, the message into something that they can penalize and compartmentalize versus it being.
A thought. Would you say, friends, that in some ways districts and boards and superintendents are, quote, running scared? Because they're so careful. Barbara, you mentioned the zero tolerance policy earlier. They're so careful not to get in trouble. They're walking fine lines. And I think they're now applying scalpels that sever bone and marrow apart. It's become so, it's as if they're walking a very thin razor sharp line. We don't want to teeter in either direction. And the line has gotten narrower and narrower over the past 30 years in my experience.
Mm.
And I wish there was a way to create a win-win out of this. At the moment, I'm at a loss on how to do so.
So I love your point here. And again, it just jogged a thought here. So we've set policy, but no organization can operate on policy alone. And I am sure there was training to go with. So that's then creates the awareness. But with any policy, you'd need then what are the guidelines, the standards? How do you execute against that? And is then there an opportunity that, and they shall communicate this? And shall not communicate what is and isn't
Right.
acceptable. Within a corporation, they have brand guidelines, how to use their logo, how to represent, such that it is absolutely clear then how to communicate the value or the messaging. Was their awareness training, their DE&I training sufficient, or did we not equip the teachers with the information on how best then to execute and express the policy regarding inclusive and a safe environment? Maybe that's missing, and that's a greater opportunity for other organizations, not to run scared, but if you provide the standards and specifications and guidelines, then people know how to operate.
Right.
You remind me of one of my go-to sound bites that
Okay.
compliance is often the enemy of ethics. When there's a fallback on checking boxes, on protocols, on systems and procedures, to the point where there's no initiative, there's no judgment, there's no common sense, there's no intuition. I mean, you need systems, you need compliance laws. But when that leads to an abdication of responsibility, because now that I'm in compliance, I'm covered. And my wife teaches special ed in middle school, and she complains about over her career the continuing increase of paperwork and forms and procedures, and from her point of view, it's all for one purpose: protection from litigation.
Very nicely put. I almost said CY anyway.
Yes, exactly.
Same thing.
I'm curious to know, though. I would be curious to know what, if anyone ever asked, I mean, in administration, did they ask students, fellow educators, parents in the community, when you read that sign, what message do you receive?
Mm-hmm.
Someone somewhere saw everyone is welcome here, multicolored hands, and found it politically controversial. What did they see? What does the average student in the classroom see? What do the educators see when they see that sign? What do parents and families see when they walk in and see that sign? How do they interpret that? Did anyone ever ask that question? Because I'm hard pressed I'm hard pressed to conclude that a vast majority of individuals saw that sign and their first response was politically controversial. Was it the different colors? Did somebody assume it meant rainbow? Because we tend to fixate on what we think. We see something and we assume about it. Could that have been the issue? I'm curious to know, did anyone ever poll it? What is it saying to you? What did you derive from that poster? I'd be very curious to find out.
And certainly, again, we go back to the realm of conjecture where we're spending a lot of time today.
Yes.
But I'm just sort of guessing or assuming that Idaho may look a lot different from New York City, Chicago, Atlanta, and maybe a poster that has two white or white adjacent hands and half a dozen more pigmented hands. Maybe there was some perception that that was not representative of the student body or the community at large, and therefore there was some sort of implied political statement there. Again,
we see the world as we are and not as it is. And so each person that looked at it, to your point, Mark, saw something through their own eyes, what they wanted to see.
And everybody is right. Seek to understand, and everybody will have a different perspective or an opinion on it. So then which one is right? So then I mean, I know she decided to resign on her own. She probably would have gotten kicked out eventually, but
Yeah.
God, there's got to be more tolerance in this world. I'm sorry, Mark, were you going to say something next?
Just to complicate things, what if the poster had no images, just the words?
Yeah.
Everyone is welcome here. Would that have caused a stir, or would it have been left as is? Again, more conjecture. We have no idea. Maybe it
No.
is about the image
Well,
of
Mm,
the
that would
hand.
have been a nice choice for the board
Yep.
to have
Come
said, this is what we find objectionable. This is
clarify.
how you can make
Yeah,
it
that's what I
Explain.
think.
compliant.
Yep. Right.
And we want to work with you so that you can project the message that you want the children to get in a way that our concerns will not be violated.
Yeah, I really second that because it speaks to what is actually the political aspect of this that is waxing and waning, and which is the value piece that should be constant and permitted to be on the wall, right? And how can we separate those two things?
And maybe if someone said, hey, you know what? Maybe the colors are controversial. Let's take those down. Have
Right.
the poster there. What do you think? Now, was that conversation ever begun? I have absolutely,
Yeah, we
positively
don't
no
know.
idea. But to me, I'm thinking, how do we get a win-win?
Hmm.
And perhaps the win would have been a conversation about how could we modify the poster so we get the message across without any potential political controversy.
I love your point of, right, how can we have this conversation? And we're having it now, right? It's post fact, and we're not involved. We're not emotionally involved. We have nothing at stake in the issue. And I think this is what's lacking, right? The ability to have a conversation, a debate, a difference of opinion around things that matter, that could be emotional, that could have high stakes. And so, I love that we do this. And what I'm reminded of is something that my youngest, so 11, just recently did as part of a new school that she's in. She's in an online school, and they're doing some social skills programs or classes as part of this experience. And the pilot experience was called Global Headlines, and they brought together 6th to 8th graders, and they pulled headlines like, should robots have rights? Should we be doing gene editing and gene manipulation for designer babies and things like that? Should we? How about so related to this topic, the Olympic Rules Committee and their rules around political and other opinion statements by Olympic athletes, because we had a few issues this time around, right, of folks breaking or getting past what the Olympic Rules Committee considered their neutral issue. So they pulled these global headlines down, and then they did this exact exercise. They were to state an opinion, show their reasoning, have some evidence, do some research, and then ask these questions. Tell me more about that, or here's how I disagree with you, or right, and practice exactly what we're doing right here. And I think, right, all schools should be doing that, right? How are we not teaching civil discourse and conversations inside of school programs for all ages? Because that is also how this problem could have been solved differently.
Yeah, somebody that's really worth looking up. Still hope we get on the podcast one of these weeks. Brooke Detterline works with a project called Moral Courage, and they do very much what you're describing,
Yeah.
Kirsten. They get teenagers, young people, and they have them role play discussions about values,
Nice.
so that when they actually have to confront people or are confronted by people, they'll have that muscle memory.
Yes.
Because very often, we feel passionate, we feel secure, but we haven't had the experience of having to articulate ourselves when we're confronted. It trains them and gives them that confidence and teaches them how to be articulate without being aggressive or going on the attack. And I think it's just a wonderful program. And that type of thing would serve all of us better.
And I must say, I appreciate Kirsten's choice of online school. To have 11-year-olds have that depth of conversation about these issues. I admire that because they're being taught to think, not just to write, read, and copy and memorize. They're being taught to think. And maybe 20 years from now or 30 years from now, your daughter may find herself in a kind of podcast like this, having this kind of discussion, but equipped with
On the moon.
what you and her educators have taught her, and
Yeah.
to be able to have these kinds of conversations and hopefully offer some wisdom and direction to those who are grappling with these gray areas.
Mhm.
Well, you mentioned that, Mark, and if I were wiser, I'd probably wait till we're safely behind the paywall to share this story. But when I was teaching, and it was an advantage that I had teaching in a private school and a religious school, where values were part of the curriculum, formally and informally. And I don't remember how it was apropos, but I put and I put this as an extra credit question on an exam. So there was no, you wouldn't lose any points one way or the other. And I posed the following. I said that conservatives typically support capital punishment, which is taking the lives of violent criminals, and oppose abortion, which is taking the lives of unborn children. Liberals typically support abortion and oppose capital punishment. How can you see this not as self-contradictory by both sides? Well, one student certainly snorted and huffed and came up and threw her paper down on my desk and stormed out of the room. And subsequently, her mother called and complained to the principal, and we had to have a meeting.
How dare you make her think deeply?
Yes,
about
well,
moral
Lord.
issues.
What were you thinking?
Yes.
Intellectual consistency will not be in this house.
And there was no, there was no advocacy of one position over another. It was simply, can you articulate how there is actually consistency here or not? Just didn't want to deal with it.
Wow. Wow.
Well, we're having a conversation now, and as Kirsten said, they don't know us in Idaho. Of course, when Jonathan's podcast reaches millions through LinkedIn and other platforms, but the fact that we're having this conversation now is, I find, refreshing, but also inspirational in that we can still have these kinds of conversations about thorny issues, hopefully without fear of any kind of reprisal. And it is my hope that these kinds of conversations are taking place in Idaho and everywhere else around the country, because we have to think about not only what happens in the classroom in the middle school, but what happens across our society, across the country and the world, at a time when the world is undergoing its fair share of turmoil and concern and conflict. And it also gives me pause to wonder if the art of conversation and diplomacy is being lost. And the idea of trying to compromise in a good way, what could be a win-win here? And in this case, simply could be removing the images, I don't know. But if we can all think more clearly, communicate more clearly, and be willing to have these kinds of conversations, to me, the best part is it's also a means of teaching those middle school kids of the proper way to handle these kinds of controversies. And that if that discussion has been had in Idaho, then kudos to them. I don't know if it has, but hopefully the behavior of the adults, the mature, who are willing to have the conversation, who are willing to hear those who oppose their point of view, and find a workable, amicable, even if it is tense, a solution, I think that will be certainly instructive to the young people who are there on the ground, experiencing and witnessing this. Just a closing comment on my part.
I think it's a nice mic drop.
I support it. Great conclusion, Mark. Thank you.
We can continue a little bit in the second segment, and if you'd like access to that second segment and other backstage conversations, go to my Substack, look at becoming a premium member, have access to those. If you have a topic that you would like us to take up on a future program, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information. Submit your idea if it's compelling. We'll definitely use it in the future. But for now, Mark Brown, Deb Coviello, Kirsten Yurich, thanks so much. Very thoughtful, balanced, and perhaps influential conversation.
Hello.
Thank you.
Until next time, continue, please.
Our pleasure.
Grappling with the Grappling.